In this presentation, what I want to do is elaborate on the notion of empowerment and more specifically elaborate on the role that power relations play in success or failure of students growing up in multilingual contexts. And when we look at the role of power relations historically in education, probably in virtually every context around the world, we see patterns of success and failure in schools that are directly related to how power has been exercised. In the Canadian context, for example, when we look at Indigenous students, First Nation students, as they're typically called within the Canadian context, we see a pattern where students were taken from their families, educated in residential schools, brutally beaten if they spoke their first language, where the whole focus of schooling was on stripping students of their identities, and unfortunately succeeded very well, which is why there's only a small proportion of Indigenous languages in Canada that are likely to survive over the next 50 years. So there's no question that power relations historically have played a major role in schooling in contexts around the world. Now, power relations can be exercised either explicitly through, for example, punishing students for speaking their language, making them feel ashamed of their culture and religion and language, or more subtly. And in many contexts in Europe and North America, we've gone from more explicit and brutal exercise of coercive relations of power in schools to much more subtle forms where we don't punish students for speaking their language. We don't see their languages necessarily as being problematic. We just ignore them. And so this benign neglect also communicates a status differential between students' first language and the important language of schooling. So, for example, in many jurisdictions across Canada, there's no provision for teaching the languages of students from immigrant background, despite the fact that in some contexts, more than 50% of students in a school system may come from home backgrounds other than English. And this is because we haven't really thought deeply enough about how we can communicate powerful messages to students coming from multilingual backgrounds about the value of their language. That's beginning to change, I think, in certainly the Canadian context and in North American context more generally, but it's still in its infancy. And so when we look at how power is being exercised within schools, I think we need to look at this from a pedagogical point of view. We need to look at accepting the fact that power is infused in all aspects of schooling, from the way the curriculum is developed, from the languages that are deemed suitable for instruction, from the teachers that make it into this make it to be teachers within the school system, the languages that they speak. All of these things reflect on patterns of dynamic power relations within the society. And they affect pedagogy. They affect the messages that students are going to get, and they affect the extent to which students will be given opportunities to engage academically or withdraw academically. So a framework that I've used and that I talked about in one of the previous segments is one that I think is a useful starting point because it brings together both the psycholinguistic dimensions of effective instruction, but also the sociological dimensions. And the sociological dimensions come in terms of the two boxes that highlight the importance of connecting to students' lives and affirming identities. The framework basically is saying, and the research is saying, that literacy engagement is a powerful determinant of the extent to which students will develop literacy skills in school. In order to make that happen, we need to support students in gaining access to literacy in both languages, but particularly the second language. We need to connect to their lives, we need to affirm their identities, and we need to take every opportunity to reinforce their awareness of how academic language works. And comparing and contrasting languages and teaching for transfer across languages is one very powerful way of doing that. But when we look at this framework, when we look at the importance of connecting to students' lives, when we connect to students' lives as educators, when the curriculum is tapping into things that students are familiar with or that are relevant in their context, then what we're doing is we're affirming the legitimacy and the validity of the cultures that students are bringing into school. And so it's an affirming message. If you look at the typical schooling in the past in colonial contexts, where in a British colonial context, they may have learned about the royal family in England. They may have learned the same kinds of content that students in public schools in England might have been learning. Totally irrelevant to their lives, but essentially making the point that this is important, whereas what is in the lives of colonial subjects or people in colonial contexts is not important. So reversing that is reversing a historical pattern of power relations. And identity is important in the sense that the way in which we negotiate identity with our students in schools reflects in either a positive or negative way the pattern of power relations in the broader society. So when we look at factors that historically have contributed to the frequent educational failure of Indigenous students or marginalized students, a number of things pop up. First of all, being educated through a language other than the home language without being given adequate support to acquire the school language has clearly been one factor. However, it's by no means the only factor or even the most important. It certainly is important, and injecting students' first language into the curriculum is important in multiple ways. But we need to look very closely at the pedagogy that's going on in schools because lack of comprehension of the school language is not the only factor operating here. So sociological factors related to patterns of colonization and the devaluation of Indigenous cultures, language and religions by the dominant group or groups has also been a major contributor to school failure. And so it follows from this that any effective education program must challenge the colonial legacy and or current discourses of devaluation of the culture and languages of communities. And so bilingual education, which includes the student's mother tongue, can help, but the pedagogy must also affirm students' identities, their academic identities, their personal identities, and their cognitive identities. So if we look at this, at the research relating to this, one obvious factor that jumps out immediately at a person who looks at the historical legacy or the research carried out historically is that the groups that tend to experience long-term underachievement are groups that typically have been at the wrong end of a coercive power relationship over generations. If you look at African American students in the United States, if you look at Indigenous students in contexts around the world, if you look at Latino and Latina students in the United States, again, you've got the same pattern. If you look at Roma students in many European contexts, the patterns are very, very similar. Students the community as a group has been devalued, has been marginalized, has been discriminated against in multiple ways in the society. And schools have played their role as reinforcing the priorities of the society, the power relations operating in the society, and they have communicated that same devaluing message to the students. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's a very eminent African-American educator in the United States, expressed it very clearly and very succinctly in talking about African-American students. She said the problem that African-American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. So what are the implications of this for understanding effective instruction in school? Let me go back first to the slide that I showed in a previous segment, and this is the notion of empowerment, where we can distinguish between coercive relations of power and collaborative relations of power. And this distinction corresponds to the two most common meanings of the term power that you'll find in any dictionary. The notion of having power over somebody else or one group exercising power over another, as opposed to the notion of gaining the power to do things that you couldn't do before or being empowered. And this distinction translates very directly into a definition of empowerment as the collaborative creation of power, where power is being generated in the interactions between individuals or between groups, such that the more power one individual or group gains, the more is generated for the other group to share. So a teacher teaching in a classroom where students are coming from multilingual backgrounds, as students gain knowledge, as their multilingual talents are affirmed, as they gain the opportunity to do powerful things in their two languages, they develop a sense of empowerment and affirmation of identity. As that happens, the teacher is also being empowered because she or he sees the effect of the instruction that they're providing. And that confirms their sense of identity as an effective teacher. So what does this notion of empowerment mean for what we do in the classroom? How do we translate that into effective pedagogy that will enable students coming from home backgrounds and community contexts that have been characterized in the past by widespread school failure? How will it help these students to succeed academically? And to do this, we need to see the role of societal power relations as manifesting themselves in a variety of ways within schools. They manifest themselves in the organization of schooling, for example, curriculum, pedagogy, language of instruction, teacher education, etc., and in the ways in which educators and students negotiate identities within the classroom, the pattern of interactions, and the messages that students get as a result of those patterns of interactions. And so the basic argument coming from this framework is that students from subordinated or marginalized groups are disempowered educationally in very much the same way that their communities have been disempowered historically in their interactions with social institutions or with dominant groups. And the logical implication is that these students will succeed academically to the extent that the patterns of interaction in school reverse those that prevail in the society at large. In other words, if education is to be effective in closing the achievement gap, educators individually and collectively must challenge the operation of coercive power relations as they're manifested in the school context. And this is a very different notion of teacher identity than the one that is typically seen in school contexts around the world. Typically, teachers will see themselves as transmitting the curriculum, and that's the role that society gives them. But what this is saying is that if we want to transmit the curriculum effectively, we've got to pay attention to the sociological context and the patterns of interaction that are going on between students and teachers, and the extent to which those patterns are communicating identity-affirming or identity-enhancing messages to students. Because if students are coming from historically marginalized backgrounds, their communities have received messages that are devaluing to their identities. And so effectiveness has got to mean challenging these patterns of coercive power relations and communicating a very different message to students. So this framework tries to express that in a fairly straightforward way. What it's saying is that societal power relations influence the ways in which educators define their roles, in other words, teacher identity, and also the structures of schooling with respect to curriculum, funding, assessment, etc. And these factors in turn influence the ways in which educators interact with linguistically and culturally diverse students. So if the society as a whole considers a particular group of people to be inferior, and teachers are representative of that society, they will probably also bring those assumptions into the classroom and communicate those assumptions to students, and that'll perpetuate the pattern that we're talking about. So what we're talking about is teachers actively challenging assumptions that may be prevalent in the wider society. And so the interactions that teachers orchestrate can have a huge amount of power, because these interactions with linguistically and culturally diverse students form an interpersonal space within the classroom. And obviously learning happens within that interpersonal space, but also identities are being negotiated. And these identity negotiations are always either reinforcing coercive relations of power or promoting collaborative relations of power. And if we want students to succeed, the interactions have to be promoting collaborative relations of power. So another way of looking at this is to ask ourselves collectively within a school, what image of the child are we sketching in our instruction? Is the child getting a message that he or she is capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate? Obviously, if students' first language is ignored within the school, they're not going to get that message. If they're never given opportunities to do powerful things with the language, they're not going to get the message. Is the child getting the message that she or he is capable of higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments? Well, we've got to look at the opportunities they have within the classroom to engage in higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments. And the same applies to an image of the child as being capable of creative and imaginative thinking. Is the child getting a message that she or he is capable of creating literature and art, capable of generating new knowledge, capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues? If students are not getting these messages from their interaction within schooling, then they're not developing an identity of what some people have called an identity of competence in relation to these things. If they're not getting a message that their bilingualism or multilingualism is a valuable personal and social asset, they're not going to value their multilingualism or bilingualism. Let me just show you some examples coming from a very different context, coming from the Toronto context, that show how much of a mindset this is amongst educators. That if we switch our mindset just a little bit, important things can happen, and very different messages can be communicated to students. This is just a tour through the corridors of one elementary school in the Toronto Board. It's a highly diverse school. It serves students from multiple backgrounds. The vast majority of students are coming from backgrounds other than language backgrounds other than English. When you walk into the school, the first thing you see is a sign for the office that's not just in one language or two languages, it's in multiple languages, the languages that are prevalent within the community. This is communicating in a very simple way that the school values the linguistic diversity of its students and communities. When you go into the library, you see books in languages other than just English. These are languages of the community. In this particular school, the school stays open 4 days a week between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock so that parents can come in and read with their children or take out books in their home language or in English to read with their children. When you walk through the corridors, you see bilingual work that students have done. Even though English is the only language of instruction in the school, the atmosphere, the messages that teachers are trying to create is that other languages are valuable too. So students may carry out work or write things in English in school and then go back and work with their mum or dad to come up with first language versions of what they're doing. In this case, this is a student from a Spanish-speaking background. The class has obviously been talking about issues relating to character development and values, and they're talking about the word empathy. And the word empatia is one that the student has written about and posted on the wall. So it's not just hidden in the student's copybook, it's there on the wall to express the identity of the school, the values of the school, and it communicates those values to students, to parents, and others who walk in. You go into the library, and there are large posters, large displays reflecting the work that students have done in the class. So this is a project that students in a class carried out on hunger, a real social issue in the community. And so what we're looking at here is the school creating an identity for itself and communicating identities to students, or opening up possibilities for identity development of students, that they are capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues. They're capable of higher order thinking, and it's showcasing their accomplishments in this regard. Now, clearly, in different contexts, there will be different possibilities, but the point that I want to make here is that we have choices. As educators, we have choices in the work that we do, and we can choose to communicate a variety of different messages to students about what they're capable of. Another strategy that's been used in many Canadian contexts is enabling students to write dual language books. So again, even though in this case Urdu is not a language of instruction in the school, because it's a highly multilingual school, these students carried out a social studies project in both their languages. They wrote a story dealing with immigration in both English and Urdu, And when you look at videotapes that we've got of them doing this, there was a lot of talk about language going on, a lot of metalinguistic talk about how you'd say this in English or how you'd say this in Urdu. So again, welcoming children's home languages into the classroom, even though we may not be in a position to teach through those languages, can convey very powerful messages. So just to conclude, what we need to do is look at both the sociological context, be aware of the historical context that has led to school failure on the part of particular communities, and reverse what we've done in the past, reverse the dimensions of schooling that have contributed to that school failure. And those dimensions of schooling inevitably involve devaluation of the identities of students, the languages of students, the cultures of students, sometimes the religions of students, and their communities. And so if we reverse that pattern, then we come to a very simple conclusion. It's one that I mentioned in the initial segment. If you want students to emerge from schooling after 12 years or however many years as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented, then treat them as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented from the first day they arrive at school. So in contexts where the languages of students and communities have been systematically devalued, then enabling them to carry out powerful, identity-affirming intellectual work in these languages involves challenging coercive relations of power and promoting collaborative relations of power. And hopefully empowerment will be the outcome of that, because empowerment is fundamental to strong literacy development in whatever languages of schooling are in place. Thank you.